Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Lydia and I'm from the comms team here at the ASA. I'm joined by my colleague Andy Taylor, who's a Regulatory Policy Executive at CAP.
Good morning.
And we're here to talk today about guidance and general protection for under 18s when it comes to gambling advertising. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're going to go into today, I'm going to talk about briefly who we are and what we do, for those of you that aren't aware. And then Andy's going to cover some of the challenges that the industry's had to tackle. And then we're going to move over onto our priorities in terms of protecting children, holding advertisers to account. And there will be time for questions if you have any at the end. So who we are. The Advertising Standards Authority and CAP, the Committees of Advertising Practice. We're a self and co-regulatory body. So the CAP part of the organisation writes the rules, and the ASA administers and enforces those rules. Just broadly, we cover all UK marketing, which includes online, companies' own websites and social media. We deal with around 30,000 complaints a year, and our work takes the form of both proactive monitoring and compliance work. And we provide a wealth of industry advice and guidance available both on our website and often in forms such as this, as a webinar. So the Committee of Advertising Practice is made up of both trade and professional organisations. The ASA is the public-facing side, which, as I said, administers and enforces the rules, investigates the complaints, and then publishes the rulings about whether or not ads have broken our rules. So what do our rules do? The rules are basically in place to ensure that ads are legal, decent, honest and truthful, and this covers both non-broadcast and broadcast. It covers content and placement of ads, as well as promotional marketing and database practice, which contains both general and sector-specific rules. So basically, we look at the content and context of ads and judge whether they comply. So on to the topic of the day, gambling. Gambling, for obvious reasons, is one of our sensitive categories, rules which you'll all be aware of and that are in place for good reasons. We're going to talk a bit more about those today. Some of the headline rules appear on this slide here, which Andy will go into more detail about, and you'll see obviously there's a focus on protecting vulnerable audiences here. So some of the more specific challenges that we face as a regulator, and also some of the challenges for advertisers. In terms of setting the scene, gambling, understandably so, is a topic consistently debated in the public arena, brought up by MPs and public figures alike. So it remains a hot topic, and Andy's now going to take you through some of the wider context around areas of concern when it comes to gambling advertising.
Yeah, I think Lydia's very much correct there in terms of the public profile of the issue of gambling advertising. I think gambling is always something where there's a significant element of controversy. We know that there is a large proportion of people in general who have reservations and concerns. They don't participate in gambling. Obviously, gambling advertising is the thing that they see. It is the window into gambling, and if they object to the activity itself, the advertising is the thing that sort of sets their concerns going. I mean, just there's a few examples here of what we've seen developing, and hopefully this will just give you an idea to set the scene of where we are in early 2019. We've seen a variety of headline catching examples of non-compliance. Now, you might appreciate that in practice some of these are quite minor. So for example, we've seen instances of gambling ads being served on the youth or children's sections, supporter sections of football club websites. Probably not got a massive traffic, but they are technical breaches of the code. They are things which need to be dealt with, and they have been found by journalists and held up in lights. The same with things like games tiles. We've also seen examples of quite poor practice from things like affiliates, recent rulings where affiliates were making all sorts of ridiculous claims about gambling ad winnings being able to fund individuals' treatment for very serious medical conditions and so forth. These might be very much the acts of an irresponsible minority, but unfortunately they generate significant coverage. I think also what we've seen in terms of ASA casework over certainly the past 5 years, if not more, is this emphasis on seeing again and again rulings being published about misleading free bets and bonus ads. This is a problem. It's been identified by the Competition and Markets Authority, the Gambling Commissioner on it, and we'll continue to work through it, but it is a lingering issue that I think the industry needs to deal with. In relation to under 18s, there is a clear need for greater evidence and greater understanding of what has happened since 2007 when the Gambling Act came in. What is the impact been on our nation's children? And obviously Gamble Aware have commissioned a very considerable set of research projects, and we're going to see them coming out towards the end of the year. And obviously they are focused directly on the question of advertising. They are there for the ASA system. They are there for the Committees of Advertising Practice to respond to. We've very recently, in terms of the debate around exposure, around visibility, seen the industry making welcome moves in terms of its extension of the voluntary code to cover sporting events on television before the watershed, so effectively closing that space when advertising was available, or advertising space was available. And we continue to see, I think, what are evolving issues. There are wider questions than just advertising around sponsorship arrangements in sport, logos on jerseys, as it were, and we're also seeing more questions being asked increasingly about modes of play which are sort of outside the traditional mainstream. So things like loot boxes, skins betting, they're not the domain of gambling operators per se, but they are issues and they are questions which are coming up increasingly in the public sphere.
Great, thanks, Andy. So onto the guidance. We published this guidance in February, which hopefully you'll all be aware of, and it came into effect from the 1st of April. So Andy, in terms of a bit of an introduction, perhaps you could walk us through the background of how this was developed.
Yes, what you've hopefully been enjoying reading over this past month, since or even since February when we published it originally, is that the second of two sister documents that deal in much greater detail with the specific gambling requirements of the UK advertising codes. So going back 12 months, we had the first piece of guidance dealing with responsibility and problem gambling. That's focusing on adults. It's focusing on adult player protections, etc., around vulnerable individuals in terms of things like appeals, inappropriate appeals to financial worries and sexual success, etc., featuring problem gambling behaviours. That's now joined in what we're talking about today by the protections for children and young people. Is obviously the other half of the work that these sections of the codes do. They are both, well, more directly a response to DCMS's review, which was published last year, on responsibility, social responsibility measures, and at the same time they are yet again another demonstration of our continuing commitment to focus on sensitive categories, alcohol, HFSS foods, and so forth. Gambling is in that. They are potentially risky areas. There are obviously issues here. We need to be on the front foot in dealing with them.
Thanks, Andy. So you talked a bit about what's in the guidance there, and when it comes to the role of the guidance, how will the ASA use this? So how does this work in practice?
Well, the rules, there are only really 3 rules which directly relate to under 18s within the codes, and we're obviously going to cover those 3 very shortly around targeting, particular appeal, and under 25s. And those rules are obviously very short. They are rules, they are basic principles. The guidance's role is to flesh those out. Its role is there both to steer the day-to-day work the ASA does. When it receives a complaint, it's going to assess that again through its procedures, and when it gets to the point at which it considers whether there is an issue under the codes, it will use the guidance to have a look at the particular issue, so a depiction of an animated character, for example. The guidance draws on all sorts of different sources. These 2 documents were based on reviews of the relevant evidence base, the emerging evidence in the past few years that inform parts of it. Other elements of the guidance are distillations of ASA rulings. So effectively the ASA has established what you could describe as a case law over a particular question, and perhaps how an individual who's under 25 has been featured. That then forms the basis of the policy. At the same time, it's always useful from a regulatory perspective to sort of draw together existing guidance. We have lots and lots of resources, which we will talk about doubtlessly later, but they can always be drawn together, I think, in a more a better packaged and concentrated form, which we hope we've done here. The key thing, though, is at the same time it is for the regulator and also for the advertiser, for operators. It's there to guide you. It is a document which lays out our position. Using that document as part of your sort of rationale for justifying approaches, etc., in your marketing is obviously good practice, because it shows that you're thinking about the code, thinking about the requirements of the code, the ASA's rulings and precedent, etc. And also it gives you that assurity of being able to argue your case in the event of an adjudication. What underlines all of these issues is this balance. We've looked at the evidence in great detail on several occasions over the past 5 years. We think that responsible, and it's obviously underlined in this slide, I think for good reason, responsible gambling advertising that complies with the code, we don't see it being a causal or a significant factor in problem gambling related harm, and that would include also issues in relation to under 18s gambling. However, there are risks there, things that we consider to be irresponsible risk factors, and they're problems and they must be countered, and this guidance is an example of how we're seeking to do that in an ever more detailed and focused fashion.
Thanks, Andy. So it might be helpful now if next you take us through some of the general rules and requirements, and then I know we'll talk about under 18s a bit more specifically after that.
Well, one of the overall requirements of the code, and obviously the code applies, we're talking today about gambling rules and a very specific part of those. Obviously the rest of the code applies to you as well, from everything from misleading advertising through to database practice and things like that. And one of the key rules, one of the key catch-alls, is this idea of social responsibility, and I think basically it can be distilled into the notion that, you know, if it's something which seems a bit silly and a bit irresponsible, then you probably shouldn't be doing it in an ad. I think I've already mentioned the general protections for adults, for wider audiences, featuring problem gambling behaviours. Again, they sort of slot in, I think, quite reasonably and logically under the idea of social responsibility. But obviously that's important. And I think the key thing that we're sort of going to build on today here is that under 18s are not legally allowed to participate in gambling activities. They are inherently off limits when you are producing a marketing communication. They shouldn't be in your marketing communications. They shouldn't be addressed directly by your marketing communications. Your ads are for adults. And I think one of the things, it's not within the code as a specific requirement, but obviously the code works on a reverse burden of proof. You're required to show that you have complied, and within that's obviously an implied threat that if you can't, that you have inherently breached the code. But also I think it's something to work with. It's a space for responsible operators, as we place an onus on you to think about what you were doing when you were producing a communication, who it's going to go to, potential vulnerabilities of audiences, how that might play in terms of content targeting. It's an opportunity for you to do the right thing and ensure that you're going through the processes, the thinking when you're putting the communications together, to be able to satisfy the the ASA that you've complied with the codes.
So just building on what you mentioned there, Andy, in terms of the responsibility burden of proof on the advertiser, when it comes to directing ads, how do you avoid those audiences that are under the age of 18?
I think just giving a brief overview. Well, I think we'll come to those in just a second. Obviously, we have the social responsibility point. It's sort of a collection of quite basic principles on that, which I think are partly common sense. But when you start to unpack them, as we will do shortly, I think that gives you an idea of where we want to set the bar here. I mean, firstly, it's about targeting. This is about media selection. So the content, not yet. We're not dealing with that just yet. Basically, before you put an ad out there, you need to have taken the necessary steps to ensure it's going to the right places. Children can see gambling ads, but those gambling ads, well, those environments in which they do see them, must be non-child oriented media, or media where they're not a significant component of the audience. At the same time, those ads that they do see should not contain content of particular appeal. Effectively, I describe this as hooks within the content that will draw their attention, draw their interest, affinities, etc. Things that will make the marketing impactful to them. Impact away all you want, and as long as it's within reason, to adults within an audience, but protect the children. The ads should be going over the children's heads to the adults within an audience. Under 25's rule, again, we'll come to that shortly, but that's a way of just cementing that and ensuring that we're solid in terms of keeping ads away from the attention of younger audience members. And the guidance, as I've said, is designed around the idea of fleshing these concepts out, which we will hopefully do very, very shortly.
Thanks, Andy. So I think there are two parts to this next bit in terms of targeting ads responsibly. And obviously that should be one of the primary considerations for gambling advertisers. So how does this work in practice? Can you walk us through that?
I've got a couple of slides here. I mean, it's effectively in two halves. There are such things as children's media. So a magazine for children, it could be a website which is titled Kids Games, which has lots of games which are for children. It's obvious and clear that that type of media should not be surrounded by gambling advertising. It's not the platform for that. So there is a hard sort of deck in this where you do not go with your advertising into these environments. On television, obviously, there are such things as children's channels and day parts which are for children's programming. Again, ads for gambling products simply cannot be scheduled there under any circumstances. In terms of the definition, I think it's reasonably straightforward in the sense of the media will self-declare what it is for, and if there is this sort of obvious target by the purpose, the commissioning, the background to which the media is there, and that is focused on children, then there is an issue. The second part of this is all other media. So this is media which is not targeted explicitly at children because it is for children. This is anything. It could be programming which has very broad age range, very broad appeal. It could be adult programming. It could be sort of various niche types of programming or content. Here is where you may place your ads. However, you need to satisfy on the non-broadcast side of things this 25% audience requirement, and on the TV side what we call the 120 index, which we can perhaps describe a bit more shortly.
Thanks, Andy. So I don't know if there's anything on this next slide that you want to touch on in more detail in terms of when an advertiser has to bear in mind the people they don't want to target.
I just go back to the point about TV. Fortunately, it took me many years to get my head around the concept of indexing and the 120 index. Fortunately, most of this is done for the ad business by broadcasters. Effectively, what they're looking at is they're using the Broadcast Advertising Research Board data on TV audiences, and effectively they're looking for audiences where children under 16s, they use a proxy of 10 to 16 to represent the under 18 age bracket, where they're looking for instances where that group are overrepresented by 25% compared to their size or their proportion within the wider audience. Basically, there is a slant towards that audience. Obviously, in the non-broadcast media, we don't have BARB, so in which case there are all sorts of different sources of information. The key thing here is to build, I think, your case as an advertiser that you are putting your ads in appropriate places. So, for example, if you are selecting a magazine, there are obviously circulation statistics and data which are available on readership, and in the vast majority of instances, obviously children's magazines are out, but in the vast majority of instances that data will give you a yay or a nay that you can then relate to the ASA in the event of being challenged. Obviously, it gets slightly more complicated when we're dealing with things like online. Website analytics tend to be only partial, or for example, if you're looking at sites that have the capacity to sign in, but also have the capacity to allow people who are unsigned in to view content, you have the ability perhaps to gate content for some users, to profile them. You know how, their ages, if they've signed in, you have information on them. The key here is to use the data available, and the ASA has got lots of rulings on this where advertisers have basically satisfied these requirements because they have looked at what they had in terms of, for instance, sign-in data, etc., to get an idea of who was looking at the content. Ultimately, if you sort of take your chance, the ASA will, if there's no data or you haven't got any data, you take your chances, the ASA will basically make a decision. It will make a subjective call, and obviously with the reverse burden of proof, it's up to you to justify. The ASA isn't satisfied that you've done that, you will breach the code. So I really can't emphasize that enough. And I just say finally, there is a slight variance to this, because obviously in certain online media, so for instance, programmatic targeting, social networks, etc., there is the capacity to target more direct targeting of particular individuals. The SA has a clear position on this, that when you're doing that, you need to be certain that you are picking, for example, the behavioral interests that in a proper combination, so they don't pick out and target or potentially target younger members of the viewership, the usership of a particular website.
Okay, so that's targeting, and thanks for that, Andy. And so perhaps from a bit more of a creative perspective, we've talked about content, which is something we mentioned today, and we've used this phrase, which many of you I'm sure will have already heard of, particular appeal. So what does this mean when we talk about particular appeal? Is there some kind of test we can use to apply to content?
Obviously, the concept of appeal, it's incredibly broad. Something can appeal to someone a tiny little bit. We need to therefore sort of set a bar within that. And the way the codes and the ASA have done this in the past is this idea of particular appeal. So effectively, what we're trying to do is to gauge the level of appeal of a particular piece of content with under 18s and compare that to the likely appeal for the rest of the audience. It's similar in some ways, if you think, to what we've just discussed for the TV scheduling and targeting restriction, about this idea of comparing the levels of appeal. Obviously, it is a question of subjectivity, but there is a necessity to have this in place as a bar that you need as advertisers to think about when you're putting content out there. I think what we do tend to see here is it's not a question of going sort of finely to the line. I think, yes, there are some grey areas, but most of the time, I think, as we'll see in the example shortly, it's quite straightforward and clear. I would just add. Quite just as a slight coda to this, that there are sort of not ways around this, but there are ways the ASA has recognised in rulings where advertisers can effectively exclude under 18s from an audience. So an email communication sent to people on a mailing list, which has been drawn from people who have accounts, so they've gone through the required age verification processes, you can make a reasonable argument that you have excluded in quite to a very considerable extent. You've done everything you could to remove under 18s from an audience. And what I would say, though, is that the ASA takes quite a dim view, for example, of even adult oriented content. So for instance, a newspaper not like to have a massive child readership, but they have found gambling ads to be problematic in those spaces because of the potential for there just to be a small proportion of children. So if you can exclude very strongly, then you have a bit more scope in terms of your content.
So this next slide will show us a couple of examples, and hopefully you can all see those where you are. And Andy, perhaps you could point out some of the examples that appear on this slide in terms of problematic content or potentially problematic.
I think these are a mixture of rulings and also work that we've done in relation to compliance. And I think most of it seems to me to be quite clear. And this is where the guidance comes in to try to unpick this. We've got a variety of licensed characters involved there. We have a variety of sort of equity brand inventions. We have characters. So you've got sort of cuddly.
It's like a Santa Claus polar bear and
penguins.
But there's a rabbit too.
But those penguins might well. Is there a rabbit? Yeah, there is. The penguins look a bit like they're from Madagascar. Anyway, so a combination of equity and licensed. There's all sorts of varieties of content on here. We've got sort of the logos and sort of fairy tale kind of thing. And I think that the message is that, or certainly the way I would see this. If there is not a complete ban on the use of animation, there's not a complete ban on the use of characters, there's not a complete ban on anything sort of cartoon-like, etc. But the problem is that when things start to talk to media that children will be used to, they're used to fairy tales, they're used to sort of kids cartoons, they're used to sort of big sort of family movies and that type of thing, then you sort of have that problem. And I think another example, the tweets on the right hand side, the bottom, just there again a problem to do with the fact that teddy bears are obviously inherent to childhood for many, using well, it's a piece of experiential marketing, but obviously the second the photograph is taken and put onto Twitter, it then becomes a piece of social media marketing. That's where the ASA is setting the bar. It's taking quite a tight view on what is acceptable. And so my advice would be, when considering this type of thing, you need to see when the red flag needs to go up. So when you're talking about animations and the guidance, I can't encourage you enough to have a good look at that. The guidance and the details, the types of things which are going to send the red flag up. You then need to take a view on the risk. Obviously, there are things that you can do to gate, exclude kids from the audience in terms of mailing lists, etc., and I encourage that type of approach as well.
And a good example there of how our rules apply to companies' own social media pages as well, with a couple of the pictures on that previous slide. So we're drawing to the end of the webinar. We've got a couple more slides to run through and then potentially time for some questions, but I will rely on my capable colleague who is coordinating this webinar to inform me of that. So this next one is on the subject of under 25s, which we also have rules about. Under 25s and individuals who can or can't appear in ads. What's this in place for, Andy?
It's designed to enhance the particular appeal provisions. We've created effectively what we've described, I think, in the past as clear water between the age of participation and the age of someone's involvement in advertising. There are obvious risks when you see, characters, etc., have various forms of appeal, but when you see someone who looks like you, has interests the same as you, or is someone you aspire to be, and so forth, there are obviously inherent, I think, hooks within that. I think I've used the term before, that capacity of an ad with someone in. So just in Spate, the golfer, and there's also here Annette Oberstad, who was, she's probably a bit older by now, but she was a hot poker player back in the day, making lots of money at quite a young age. These individuals obviously have a sort of added impact in terms of what they are going to do to people similar to them in an audience. And obviously similar to them are people who are under the age of gambling. And obviously the other example there is obviously an attempt at sort of some mild humour with a child being very happy to be playing golf, although she appears to be using a driver on a putting green, but who knows. Obviously, again, she's way under the age of what's acceptable, and that as a gambling ad is problematic. But the notion here is just to provide that extra added piece of protection with a particular type of content, effectively a type of character, although they're real people, that can have that sort of added potential impact on younger audiences, particularly those who are getting towards the age of being able to gamble, who are like to see themselves in the more adult bracket, and therefore look upon these people with a sort of an affinity and an aspiration.
Great, thanks, Andy. So this brings us to our last slide, and I think there will be there's no time for questions, but you can submit questions and we can provide a written answer following today's webinar. So this slide just gives you a couple of other places you can go for info. Obviously, please do feel free to follow us, either our ASA and or our CAP account. Thanks very much for listening and following along today. And you can sign up for any future webinars via email, and if you've got any queries or questions about gambling advertising or unrelated advertising questions, then please do feel free to drop us a line. Andy, thanks very much for talking us through those slides today, and I hope you've all found this useful. Thanks for listening.